Okay, we're going to get started in just a minute.
Good in you.
Got all these
All the
contraptions.
Knowing how to use them is a whole other thing than knowing how to hold them.
Well, what happens is Okay, good morning. How are you? Here we are in Lent. Today we're going to be talking about Maundy Thursday. And I'm going to try something a little different. I hope it works. We believe as sort of Western Christians as opposed to Eastern Christians or as opposed to Greek Orthodox Christians, we believe that the Last Supper was a Seder or a Passover meal. How many people here have ever been to a Passover meal? Okay, good. Well, we're going to kind of follow sort of not the order of the Passover meal, but we're going to kind of follow the way that there are things for you to do today, and it'll be up there. We're going to have you participate by reading some of the scripture. If you've been to a Seder, you realize that they really are kind of walking through the Passover experience, the Exodus experience. And we're going to, well, I'm not going to say what we're going to do. Let's just do it, okay? Deliverance, Freedom, and Redemption, a meditation on the night Jesus of Nazareth instituted the Eucharist. We're going to begin with this question. Was Holy Thursday a Passover celebration? As with all things, there is a huge amount of discussion about this. With all theology, there's always argument. And the Synoptic Gospels, the Matthew, Mark, and Luke, affirm that it was a Passover celebration, while the fourth Gospel says that it's not. How many people knew that? Everybody? Yeah, it's kind of interesting. If you look at the fourth Gospel, they kind of specifically say that, that Jesus had to be taken down from the cross before Passover started, which would imply that it's definitely not a Passover meal. The other three are pretty firm on the idea that it was. And so we're going to kind of talk about that a little bit, and let's move on. Any questions before we get started? No? Here we go. We will work on the assumption that the Last Supper was indeed a Passover meal. We'll start by talking about, the Passover lamb, because the Passover lamb is sort of the center of the Passover meal or the Passover Seder. If you've been to a Passover Seder, and Seder is a Hebrew word which means order, and so it's the order. But if you've been to a Passover Seder, they probably did not serve lamb because, and this is kind of an interesting little tidbit, obviously they served lamb in the old days. If you go to a Southern European Passover Seder, they will serve lamb. Most of the Jews here in the United States are not what we call Sephardic Jews, Jews from Spain and the Mediterranean. Most American Jews are Ashkenazi. They're from Northern Europe, Poland and Russia and Germany. And as I had it explained to me by a Jewish theologian, the problem was that when the Jews moved to Northern Europe, the lambs were not giving birth early enough for Passover. So the sheep were not, birthing lambs, and there were no lambs. So the Northern European Jews kind of evolved this whole kind of theology around it. And they said, well, we can't have the lamb until the Messiah comes. So therefore, we will not have lamb at our Passover meal. But if you go to a Spanish Passover celebration, they will indeed have lamb. Okay, so every year on the Day of Preparation, and the Day of Preparation was the day before Passover. So now we're back in the first century in the time of Jesus. And every year, people would bring a lamb to the temple to be ritually slaughtered. The problem was that lots of people came into town for Passover, and many of them were not coming from Israel. They were coming from neighboring towns or neighboring countries. And so they had to change their money in the temple because you couldn't buy a lamb in the temple unless you had the right kind of money. Kind of like being on a cruise, if you've ever had that experience. So, and this was one of the things that upset Jesus, was that all this money changing was going on, and they had tables set up in the outer temple, and they were changing money, and he was kind of like, this is not really what the temple should be all about. The lambs represented, of course, the Passover lamb during Exodus that was killed and whose blood was smeared on the doorpost, and this caused the angel of death to pass over the homes of the Israelites. Let's talk a little bit very briefly about the Bethany connection, because it's part of our argument for why the Last Supper was indeed a Passover Seder. If you read the Synoptic Gospels, at this point, Jesus has come into Jerusalem, but he's not staying in Jerusalem. He's staying at the home of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. And they do not live within the city walls of Jerusalem. They live in Bethany, which is outside the city walls. And you might wonder, well, why is that a problem, or why are we even concerned about that? In those days, up until the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, but in those days, Passover had to be celebrated within the walls. So if you were going to have a Passover meal, you could only do that within the walls of Jerusalem. Originally, if you go back another 100 years or so, Passover could only be celebrated on the temple grounds, but people were coming into town in larger crowds every year. At some point, the temple priests decided they would consecrate the entire city of Jerusalem to be considered the temple for that day. And so you had to have a place within the temple grounds. Okay, please work. Oh, there we go. So we kind of know the story of the upper room. Jesus sent Peter and John saying, go make preparations to eat the Passover. And then he tells them to enter the city, and it's actually a longer story, but I didn't want to put it all up there. You'll see a guy carrying a bucket of water or something like that, and and follow him and tell him that, follow him, and he'll go to a certain house, and then tell that person who owns that house, the teacher asks, where is the room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? And he'll show you a large upper room. This is all in Luke chapter 22. And it's all part of our argument that, okay, the Last Supper was indeed a Passover meal. Today, we're going to kind of weave three stories together. The first story is the story of Passover and how the ancient Israelites were saved from bondage in Egypt by the hand of God. And I think it's really interesting for us to, when you look at the Passover meal, it's deeply interconnected with welcoming the immigrant, welcoming the stranger, this theme of social justice, this whole idea that we were strangers in Egypt. And so when we are confronted with the stranger, we have got to welcome them. And it's kind of an interesting thing to think about. And this is your line. Go. The first story, the story of the Jews leaving Egypt. The first story is the story of Passover, how the ancient Israelites were saved from bondage in Egypt by the hand of God. You are Yeah.
His Passover was to protect the firstborn from death. Was it also a Passover when the Israelites fled Egypt? Was that a Passover weekend?
Well, it was all part of the Passover. The Passover is the story of the Exodus. And in every Jewish Seder today even, they tell the story of how they left Egypt and how God saved them and how Moses parted the waters. And so it's a recounting, and it's kind of a really interesting experience to kind of go through a Passover with a Jewish family. Because this is what I love about Jewish Passover meals, is that when we're going to celebrate an event, we we have the teaching and we have the religious part, and we're only focused on the religious part. And then when we finish that part, we party, And with Jewish Seders, it's really interesting to me because it's all woven together. They celebrate the religious part through the food. So the food has symbolic meaning. And we'll kind of talk about that a little bit. But the second story is the story of Jesus and his apostles and how they gathered to celebrate the Feast of Passover, and how Jesus revisited the symbols of Passover, gave them new meaning, and instituted the Eucharist. So these elements, bread and wine, are part of the Passover celebration, and they have deep meaning within the Passover celebration. And so we're going to kind of try to talk about how that works. Your turn. Had come. Jesus reclined at the table. These quotes that we're using for Jesus and his apostles at the Passover meal are all from Luke, but we could have used the ones from Mark or the ones from Matthew. And they're all very, very similar. And the third story is our own. It's how we enter into the other stories, the story of Jesus instituting the Eucharist, which we celebrate every week. We're going to celebrate it in about 45 minutes. And also how we are redeemed and how we make this new commandment manifest in our lives. A new commandment I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, let's love one another. Mandatum novum is Latin. It's where we get our word Maundy from, and it means new commandment. So Maundy Thursday is the day we celebrate and relive the new commandment of Jesus. We are coming, declares the Lord. This is for guys only. I will not. This is a quote from the prophet Jeremiah, and we get through all the writings of the prophets, there's this idea that I will call you back home. The prophets were writing during the exile when the Jewish leadership was all exiled to Babylon. And so the theme of the excuse me, the theme of the prophets is we have strayed from the covenant. We need to get back to the covenant.
When the hour had come, Jesus reclined at the table with his apostles, and he said to them, I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before my suffering. I will not eat it again until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God.
Now, some of you may notice that this is a little repetitive, right? That's kind of the Passover. If you attend a Passover meal, a Seder, the themes keep coming back over and over, and the words keep coming back over and over. So, at every Passover meal, there is symbolic food. There's the karpas, which is fresh greens because it's spring, and part of the celebration is to celebrate spring. If you look out, we were talking before we began, and if you look out the windows, you can actually see some of the trees are beginning to bloom. The karpas represents spring. There's the bitter herb, or the maror. Sometimes it's just, some people use romaine. Some people get a little more heavily into it and use horseradish, which is indeed bitter. It represents the bitterness of suffering. And so there's this idea of you are tasting the suffering of the Israelites in Egypt. There's the harisset. Now the harisset nowadays is kind of pasty. It's walnuts usually ground up with apples and honey and raisins, and it's actually quite delicious. Today, the if you attend a Seder, they will tell you that this represents the mortar that we had to use when we were slaves in Egypt to build the pyramids with, or to build whatever we were being forced to build. But in the first century, it was slightly different. It represented the blood of the lamb, and it was much thinner. It was mostly red wine and honey and cinnamon and a few things like that. There's the lamb, or the zaroa, which represents, again, the paschal lamb whose blood saved the firstborn. And there's the wine, and wine represents joy. So whenever wine is drunk in the original Seder, it represents a moment of joy in the story. So when you're telling the story of the Passover, and you get to this one point where God promises the Israelites that he will redeem them, everybody drinks a glass of wine. This happens 4 times in the traditional Passover. God gave promises of freedom, and with the 4 cups, we celebrate and we recall God's promises to Israel and also to us. That's the first I will statement. I will. These are all from the book of Exodus, chapter 6. The 4 cups celebrated these 4 I will promises. The first one represents freedom, the second one represents deliverance, the third one represents redemption, and the fourth one is at the end of the meal represents thanksgiving. The first cup is the cup of sanctification and freedom. This is a Christian biblical verse. It's from the book of Galatians, and I put it here in the middle of our Seder because in the early Christian church, when the Christian scriptures were being written, it was the same themes. You know, we see Paul reiterating the same themes of sanctification and freedom. The second cup is the cup of deliverance. Yeah, and so you have this theme of bondage to freedom, which is part of the Exodus story, but it really permeates most of the Old Testament. When you read the Old Testament, you have this theme over and over. We were in bondage, and we are no longer in bondage. God has freed us from bondage. And we feel that theme in the Holy Thursday liturgy. There's the whole theme, you know, again, when you read Paul is full of the whole idea, we are free in Christ, we are no longer slaves. Now, Paul reinterprets that to say we are no longer slaves to the law rather than slaves in Egypt. But it's the same theme running through Paul and the Pauline letters. And then let's talk about the betrayal. At the Last Supper, as we all know, there was a story of betrayal. Matzah is dipped in harasset to represent the sweetness that God can bring into the most bitter of circumstances. That's part of the Seder meal. Some think at the Last Supper, the dipping of the harasset is described in the book of John, chapter 41. Jesus said, "Truly I say to you, one of you will betray me. One of the disciples asked, Lord, who is it? It is the one to whom I give this morsel after I have dipped it. Then he dipped the morsel and gave it to Judas. Whoops, I overshot that. So the next thing that comes in the Seder is the breaking of the bread, the matzah, the unleavened bread.
Our redemption is bound up with the deliverance from bondage of all people everywhere. It is only the grace of our Lord God that sets us free.
This is the bread of affliction, which our ancestors ate. All who are hungry, come and eat. All who are needy, come and celebrate this Holy Week with us. Now, it's worth noting that in Jesus' time, the Passover meal was much more simple than a Passover Seder would be today. Today, it's a huge meal. There's, if you've been to one, there's brisket, there's kugel, there's gefilte fish, although I don't know why anybody would want to eat that part. But there's all this food and there's dessert and it's a big party, and it takes place kind of toward the end of the Seder. But at the time of Jesus, it was simple. It was only lamb, unleavened bread, and herbs, the symbolic herbs, the bitter herb and the herb of spring. And so often people argue and they say, well, they say there weren't any women at the Last Supper, but they were at least cooking dinner. There really was no dinner. You took your lamb down to the temple. The priests ritually slaughtered the lamb. The lamb died. And the whole idea of sacrificing animals in Jewish theology before the temple was destroyed was that the animal was your scapegoat. The animal suffered in place of you because you sinned. The lamb had to die. Nope, no problem. So after the second cup was drunk, Jesus would have taken matzah, broken it, and blessed it. Some think that this is the moment where Jesus instituted the Eucharist. Again, going back, let me just remind you that some people don't even think that the Last Supper was a Seder, was a Passover meal. So I want to be open to that idea. But since, you may have noticed that when we have liturgy, we use unleavened bread. And, I think that kind of contributes to the idea that we are going on the assumption that this was indeed a Seder or a Passover meal. So we think this is where the bread was consecrated. And Jesus was taking this symbol, the bread of affliction, the bread that represents our suffering in Egypt, and applying it to himself when he says, "This is my body." Let's say this together. While they were eating, he took a loaf of bread, and after blessing it, he broke it and gave it to them and said, "Take, this is my body." The third cup of wine comes next. It's called the cup of redemption and represents being delivered, being saved from slavery. It reminds us that the blood of Christ was poured out for us, for our redemption. So again, he took this symbol, that this wine this third cup that already represents being redeemed and gives it a whole new meaning, a whole new level of meaning. Together, then it is believed, he took the third cup, the cup of redemption, and after giving thanks, he gave it to them, and all drank. He said to them, "This is my blood of the covenant poured out for many." So let's talk about this idea of he took the blood, he took the wine, he blessed it, he broke it, and he gave it. Henry Nouwen, who was a Catholic theologian, he explores the image that each of us is the bread, and that we have to think of ourselves as the bread. He suggests that each of us are prepared for ministry by God, and each of us have been taken, blessed, broken, and given. So I'm going to invite you at the tables to talk about this. How has God taken you out of the world? How has God chosen you? How were you taken? Take a few moments on this, and then we're going to move on to the next one. You might also want to associate it with being called or being chosen. How has God called you and chosen you? Okay, take just one moment to wrap up. This next part's going to get a little harder. How has God blessed us? How has God given us special blessing for the mission? And by the mission, I mean the mission of being a Christian in the world today. How were you blessed? Take a few moments to talk about it. Oh, you were talking so good on the first question. Jump in there. Okay, and now it's going to get even harder. God, at some point in our life, according to Henry Nouwen, now this isn't my idea, this is Henry Nouwen's. Henry Nouwen says we have all been broken, that in order to be ready for ministry, we are broken, and that you can look at that as God broke us at some point. St. Paul says that he had a thorn in his side, and he prayed for God to take it away, but that God told him, "My grace is sufficient to you." So St. Paul acknowledges that he was broken. In what way have you been broken to prepare for ministry? Tough question, I know. You know, I've heard so many people say that something bad happened to them, but that if that had never happened, they wouldn't be the person they are today. Okay, I'm going to call you back now. I apologize we don't have more time to talk about these questions, because I sense that people would like to have a little more time to explore them. And the final question is, God gives us back out to the world. Having taken us and blessed us and broken us, God gives us back to the world and sends us out to be disciples. I'm not going to have you talk about this, but I'd like you to consider it. And really, when you're home later on today, or maybe during Holy Week, think about these four questions. You know, that how has God chosen you and taken you out of the world? How has God blessed you? How has God broken you? And how has that made it possible for you to be a better Christian, if we want to leave it there? So, please please join us, consider joining us for Holy Week and for the celebrations of Holy Week this year. And we're going to conclude together. After they drank the third cup, they sang psalms and went out to the Mount of Olives. Jesus prayed, was arrested, and was taken to his trial before the Sanhedrin. Today, when we celebrate Eucharist, we remember, thank you, and sacrifice of Jesus, and we enrich our own stories of deliverance, freedom, and redemption. In each generation, at every Eucharist, all people should feel as if they have actually been delivered from slavery. We re-experience the sacrifice of Jesus because we are the redeemed of the Lord. And we can sing a new song of praise because of God's grace. And yet it is not a new song because it has been sung by countless people through the centuries as generation after generation have experienced the deliverance and redemption brought by our God. Once we were slaves, but now we are free. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Next week, I'm not sure if it's Mary Beth or Chad who will be leading the forum, and they'll be talking about one of the other celebrations of Holy Week, Good Friday or Holy Saturday. Okay, any last comments or questions? No? Okay, thank you for coming.